My Govanen Melonin and well met. My name is Bane. I am the head developer for a mod called Wainriders, which is a submod for the Dawnless Days, a modification for Total War Attila taking place in the Third Age of Middle-earth. The submod Wainriders takes the action back to the 19th century of the Third Age, where a confederation of Easterlings called the Wainriders, stirred up by the evil forces of Sauron from Dol Guldur, have invaded Gondor from the east. And the Witch King of Angmar is fighting his final wars to crush the Kingdom of Arnor and its successor states. So the world of Wainriders is a very complex, interesting period in the history of Middle-earth, and it's very rarely covered. I was inspired by a mod that's currently in development for Total War Attila, which is covering the same period in history. And I thought it would be interesting if I could see what I could do with at that time period and this concept in the Total War Attila engine. So Wainriders was born. You can see here the two factions facing off against each other. I am playing as the Wainriders, and my opponent, Coastal Canadian, is playing as Gondor. This is all, by the way, a sneak preview. Alpha build, everything is subject to change. However, in general, the rosters and faction strengths and weaknesses are more or less done for these two factions. Gondor is an incredibly durable jack-of-all-trades faction. It's got lots of high numbers, high defense, high armor infantry. It's got pretty solid archers and pretty decent cavalry. The Wainriders have excellent shock cavalry, lots of shock infantry, some good javelin units, but they don't have archers. They don't have foot archers at all. They have one unit of horse archers that's quite expensive, and they have these chariots. They've got several types of units of chariots, and I have not brought the whole roster of Gondor, or the whole roster of the Wainriders to this battle, but I've brought about half of the roster. I've got, if you look over here, my general is a chariot unit called the Great Wains. These are very heavily armored, very slow-moving, but powerful chariots, very expensive at 1,600. I have two units of Balchoth chariots. These are lightly armored, very squishy, but javelin-throwing, high-charge shock chariots, and I've got Easterling Lancers currently skirmishing. These are medium shock cavalry armed with bows, though they only have 4 shots with those bows. Iron Tower Cataphracts are my most heavily armored cavalry. They're very slow-moving at 65 speed, but incredibly heavily armored with a very high charge bonus. And Fire Riders of Nirn, who have a precursor grenade, which they throw into melee combat. I didn't end up using that grenade, and I just ended up charging into the back of these Swan Knights of Belfalas, as my opponent sends in Anflast Watch and Otar Spears to support his Gondor Cavalry, Northmen Horsemen, and Swan Knights of Belfalas. My infantry up on this hill are pretty much playing keep away with his army. I don't want to get shot at by these archers. All of my infantry that I brought to this battle are lightly armored, and they don't have shields, but they're very high damage. So I'm just playing keep away with the archers, trying to pull him in, keep them distracted while I win the cavalry engagement. Both of us were talking to each other throughout this battle, so neither of us were on our A game per se. We were talking about the mod, talking about its future development. So we were, discussing various topics. And neither of us were particularly heavily concentrated, so there will be micro mistakes. There will be cases where we both forget about units for a while. But the Balchoth chariots are coming into the back of these Anflast Watch, who have done a very good job at whittling down my Fire Riders of Nirn. I've absolutely massacred them with their precursor darts, as the Balchoth chariots run over them and do considerable damage riding through the back of these light spears. My cavalry has won its engagement. Easterling Lancers and Iron Tower Cataphracts are going to throw themselves into this engagement against these Otar Spears here, as my infantry continues to retreat and pull back in the advance of Gondor's main infantry arm. While this battle is going on, I'm about to charge into the back of these Otar Spears and finish off this blob, though the Otar will inflict considerable casualties on my horsemen. We can take a look at the rest of Gondor's army. He's brought 4 units of Otar bows. These are sort of heavily armored, short bow armed archers. Not particularly effective in doing damage, but they're incredibly tanky and very numerous, and a very useful unit, sort of a mid-tier archer for Gondor. We have the Otar swords. Again, this is sort of equivalent to a legionary type unit. Standard, men of the line, heavily armored, high defense, high armor, very tanky and very numerous, and quite affordable at 900 gold. So that's sort of your mid-tier infantry. As a side grade unit that is more expensive and in some ways more capable is the Chieftain of Orthanc. If you know anything about the lore of the Tower of Orthanc, also known as the Tower of Angrenost, or the Fortress of Angrenost, Gondor had territory north of the White Mountains, in an area of Calinarthon. And as the Great Plague swept into Gondor 200 years before the Wainrider invasion, lots of people migrated out of Calinarthon or died, and it became a depopulated region. And the control of the Tower of Orthanc went to these hereditary chieftains who were semi-loyal to Gondor, but were not of Gondorian blood themselves, or even the culture. They were from the hillmen, the middleman, the people who would basically be the ancestors of the Dunlendings. So these troops are sort of a barbarian auxiliaries, quite heavily armed and equipped, and they do have some heraldry of Gondor on them, but they look noticeably foreign in the rest of Gondor's roster. Sorry for all that talking. The Balchoth chariots have ridden into the back of these Otar spears and are finishing them off, though they have taken a bloody toll on my cavalry. In general, spears are much more effective than cavalry in this mod, though cavalry, particularly shock cavalry, has higher charge bonuses. There's all sorts of balance changes in the mod that, in the grand scheme of things, don't have much of an effect, but when combined, create quite a different experience for Wainriders. Canadian has quite a good position with his Otar bows. They're firing into my shieldless light Balchoth tribesmen who are javelineers. The engagement over here is being finished off. I am going to speed through this because there's sort of a transition period. He's moving his guards of the Citadel, who are sort of a different class of unit within Gondor and Arnor, and as well as Umbar. Umbar is going to be a faction in the mod, and these are the Dunedainic units. These are men who are Dunedain, and thus they have lower numbers because the Dunedain were getting rarer and rarer as the eras pass in Middle-earth's history. Oh, we're going to stop the speed. But they are extremely tanky at 125 health, and they generally have higher stats and higher armor than non-Dunedainic units. Though certain factions like Arthedain will be very heavy on their Dunedainic units to the point where it'll make up most of its roster. Most of Gondor's roster is made up of these middlemanish men who have pledged allegiance to Gondor but are not necessarily Dunedain in blood, or maybe have some small bit of Dunedainic ancestry, but it's become diluted from the intermixing of middlemen and Dunedain. The Chieftain of Orthanc is fighting my Easterling Longaxes, who are very light, armor-piercing shock infantry. The speed, by the way, of these light infantry is definitely going to be tweaked. It's a little... The speed itself is fine, but it looks a little janky. But these Easterling Longaxes are armor-piercing, high damage, light shock infantry, very vulnerable to archers, and they will die off very quickly because they have no armor and no melee defense. But they will do lots of damage against heavily armored units, and they're very efficient in that regard. The Balchoth tribesmen have also been supporting them with their javelins, and so that has also helped to reduce the health of these this Dunedainic general, the Roqueni of the White Tree, which is otherwise an extremely elite unit of swordsmen for Gondor. My cavalry has begun to rout the last bits of whatever Gondor had left that was sort of outside of the confines of this little perimeter they've made for themselves in the Barrow Downs. Anyway, Wainriders is set to include up to 13 different factions. They're going to be many of these factions are going to be factions that are familiar to you, or take part in the War of the Ring. They're probably going to be included in the Dawnless Days vanilla eventually, in some form or another. But many of these factions are factions that no longer exist by the time of the War of the Rings, such, for example, the Witch King Vangmar and his realm, the Kingdom of Arthedain, Umbar, lots of interest, the Wainriders, obviously, lots of interesting factions to cover, and in general, there's going to be quite a bit of difference between the factions in Wainriders compared to vanilla TDD. Factions are going to have relatively small rosters, but the goal here is that all of these units will have a purpose in the roster, and that there's not going to be, or as much as possible, I'm going to avoid having redundant units or units that are just cheaper but slightly worse stats-wise, and units that are more expensive but better stats-wise. I wanted to avoid that as much as possible and give every unit a role on the battlefield, regardless of how high-end or low-end they might be. My Wind Lances, which are extremely quick shock cavalry, charge into these Otar bows. They do tie them down in melee. However, these units are not necessarily great for long-term melee, and the Otar are equipped with swords, so they are decent enough at dealing damage to attacking infantry or attacking cavalry, if that cavalry is light enough. My remains of my Easterling Lancers are getting ready to charge into these Otar bowmen. The first unit comes in. Second unit follows up. The charge is not the greatest, and actually his Guards of the Citadel are going to follow in on that attack and try to wrap up my Easterling Lancers. Balchot chariots riding through all of these bowmen, and they are going to do considerable damage, but these units are also, again, quite fragile, quite lightly armored, and as you can see, they start dying off, even against these archers who have swords for melee defense and don't have an anti-cavalry bonus. My Balchoth tribesmen, who have finally used up the last of their javelins, get ready for a charge. As do my Iron Tower cataphracts, who are exhausted. I did run them around way too much during the battle. They were heavily engaged with all sorts of cavalry and infantry down there, and so while they are still quite healthy because of their high armor, they are exhausted, and they're going to be even slower than they normally are, given that these are super heavy shock cavalry. Balchoth tribesmen chucking in their javelins. Otar bows getting attacked in the back by these javelineers, who again have their armor-piercing axe, so they will do quite decently in melee against these Otar bows, but they are probably going to rout soon, and yep, there we go, the Balchoth tribesmen rout. My Great Wains, my general, is finally being maneuvered into position, and I'm going to get ready to ride through this chunk of archers and Guards of the Citadel, who are, by the way, extremely formidable infantry. And they are about to hack their way through the Balchoth tribesmen. The last of the Balchoth chariots dying off to the Otar bows, firing their last few shots in, as my cataphracts and Balchoth tribesmen once again maneuver. The Easterling long axes have long since died off. And that's the general theme with this faction. They do lots of damage very quickly, but they're not the most durable. And you have to use the Wainriders in a very aggressive fashion. You have to rush and do your damage very, very quickly. This is not a faction that is especially durable. As you can see, even just riding through those bowmen and the Guards of the Citadel killed 5 of the chariots in a matter of seconds. These types of units, these polearms, armor-piercing, high-damage units that are spears, that have anti-cavalry bonuses, they do extremely well, as well as javelins. Javelins do lots of damage to chariots as well. Iron Tower cataphracts going in for a charge on the Guards of the Citadel. The fighting at this point has become extremely confused blobfest, but the Guards of the Citadel are, despite being exhausted, despite being depleted, are going to do very well against these relatively lightly armored tribesmen from the east. Iron Tower cataphracts circling back for another cycle charge. The chariot heading into the back of the Guards of the Citadel. It's not a great engagement, but it's one that I had to take. The chariots start dying to the combined forces of these 2 Guards of the Citadel, which are the only thing Gondor has left at this point. However, my own forces are quite depleted. The Balchoth tribesmen are down to the last few numbers, and they're not high morale. These are low morale units. So their steadiness on the battlefield is questionable at best. Iron Tower Cataphracts charging into the guards at the Citadel. Cycling back for one last charge. You can see there's 20 seconds left on the battle. It is very close at this point, with the chariots riding in, smashing into the back of that guards of the Citadel unit, and as you can see, the last one routs. And that is a victory for the Wainriders against Gondor. Taking a look at the kills, Gondor's kill count was mostly buffed up by its some of its heavy infantry and its archers. The kill count was relatively spread out between all of my units, though some of the cavalry did not perform especially well. Of course, that was not the entirety of the Wainrider roster. We do also have the about 6 other units. Don't mind the unit cards, stats. All of these things are very much work in progress and are going to change. But we do have the rest of the Wainrider roster that you did not get to see in that battle, which I will quickly show you. So, you already saw the Great Wain. The general unit you already saw Easterling Longaxes, Balchoth Tribesmen, Wind Lances, Fire Riders, Iron Tower Cataphracts, and the Balchoth Chariots. So the units you did not see, and you also saw the Easterling Lancers, the units you did not see, the cheapest chariot available to the Wainriders is the Steppe Chariot. This is a bow-armed unit, very, very low damage, no scythes, as you can see, so the charge bonus is very low. This is the kind of unit that you would want to charge into light troops only. Wainrider Chiefs are a grenade-throwing, axed, and shield-armed unit, very useful in sieges or in field battles to break up formations of enemy infantry so that you can charge them. Variag Warriors are two-handed swords, no shield, and lower charge bonus and overall damage compared to their other shock infantry options. But they do have decent melee defense, so they are actually quite good in prolonged melee, and they sort of have an East Asian, Mongolic influence, very much inspired by Third Age Divide and Conquer, if you've ever seen that faction with the banners on the back. Adherents of the Iron Tower, the mace itself is a placeholder model, but it is going to be a two-handed mace unit. Maces in this mod are going to be anti-infantry weapons, no armor-piercing damage, but they do have very high bonuses against infantry. In this case, this is a 30 bonus against infantry unit, so rather poor against cavalry, but it is extremely heavily armored. Decent charge bonus, low melee defense, and it does have that extremely high bonus against infantry. So a very effective infantry killer, but quite expensive at 1,400 per unit. Then we have the Chosen Cavalry. This is your only horse archer as the Wainriders. It's a heavy bow cav unit armed with a mace. The mace, again, it's an anti-infantry weapon, but very low melee defense, no shield, and quite squishy. But the armor is decent, and it should be useful enough as a missile platform to support the rest of your infantry moving in, and maybe to suppress enemy archers and get them to stop shooting at your shock infantry as they charge in. And finally, the War Wains. The War Wains are your highest tier non-general chariot unit, costing about 1,200 currently. They are high charge at 200, very high attack, very high weapon damage, decent armor, but again, relatively squishy. You want to keep these sorts of units constantly moving. You want to keep them dragging through enemy lines. Isolated units of enemy infantry they will do very well against, but against polearms, against spears, and against javelins, all of the chariots for the Wainriders are very, very vulnerable. So to conclude, the Wainriders are a very shock-focused faction, lots of damage on the upfront, not a whole lot of skirmishing power.